Welcome to this afternoon's Baker Nord Center Graduate Affiliates Talk. I think I may have gotten that title right. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Hayley Verdi. Hayley's a doctoral candidate in the English department here at Case Western Reserve, and I have the honor and pleasure of chairing her dissertation committee. Hayley holds a Master's of Education from the University of Missouri St. Louis and a Master's of Education from Case Western Reserve. She's an ambitious scholar as well as a generous thinker and colleague. She's contributed much to the life of our department and to this university, including serving in leadership roles in the department and the College of Arts and Sciences. Her dissertation project, from which this talk today emerges, uses 19th century literature to interrogate the intersections of medical rhetoric, narratology, and narrative medicine. The importance of this work has been recognized by the department with the Adrian Solomon Dissertation Fellowship this academic year. And I have to say, in addition to her scholarship, Hayley has taught a variety of courses here at Case Western Reserve, including, and this is a laundry list, expository writing, creative writing, professional communication for engineers, and writing for the health professions. She's collaboratively taught in our summer bridge program for underrepresented academic writers. And perhaps nearest to the subject of today's talk, she designed and taught her own Sages University seminar entitled Illness Narratives in the 19th Century this past fall. I imagine she'd be happy to talk about that in the question and answer as well as this important paper. So please join me in welcoming Hayley Verdi, presenting her work, Living and Telling, Managing the Rhetorical Body in Harriet Martineau's Life in the SickRoom.
Thank you. I've got one. Yeah. Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here on this blustery day. So I'm looking forward to telling you about this chapter in my dissertation. It's the second chapter I'm in the process of writing, and it's taking shape. So I'm looking forward to your questions today. In 1844, Harriet Martineau, the public intellectual and literary celebrity, published 2 accounts of her recovery from a 5-year period of debilitating illness. The first was Life in the SickRoom, a collection of 10 essays in which she contemplates the subjective experience of living with an extended illness. The second was a series of 5 essays published in the periodical The Athenaeum, focused on the method she believed had cured her, mesmerism. As a cure attributed to a treatment method not sanctioned by the medical community at the time, Martineau's version of her recovery sparked a backlash from medical doctors. In 1845, one of Martineau's doctors, the surgeon T.M. Greenhow, published a medical report of the case of Miss H.M. in a publicly available pamphlet. His report included graphic details of Martineau's gynecological symptoms and her responses to various treatments, concluding that her healing by mesmerism was not possible. This offended Martineau, who was also Greenhow's sister-in-law, to the point that she severed all ties with him. Perhaps what angered her most was the way Greenhow's report contradicted and questioned her own accounts of her illness and recovery. Throughout her life, Harriet Martineau had lived both with illness and with public discussions of her illness. Writing about her physical state was central to her self-understanding and her presentation of herself to her readers. Maria Frawley explains, sickness was not only the linchpin of her self-understanding, her guiding frame of reference, it was the lens through which she wanted her readers to see and understand her life and career. Martineau's conflict with Greenhow arose not so much from her objection to having her illness made public, but from her desire to control and direct the ways that her illness and her own authority over that illness were presented. The public conflict that arose between Greenhow and Martineau, his most famous patient, pitted professional medical practice against a patient and her account of her illness and recovery. Martineau's public position, her status as both prolific author and self-proclaimed invalid, and her willingness to write publicly and often about her personal health and struggles, kept her case at the forefront of the British public's consciousness. Her published accounts of her physical health and the treatments that brought her periods of relief gained a large readership, and these accounts were often perceived as a threat to the reputation of professional medicine in Great Britain. In the months following her death in 1876, a brief article appeared in the British Medical Journal, observing how, quote, her case is not one of the triumphs of the profession, end quote, and that it had done little to, quote, add to the confidence of many persons in medical skill, end quote. In this context, T.M. Greenhow emerged from retirement in 1877 to publish an article entitled Termination of the Case of Miss Harriet Martineau in the British Medical Journal. The article was intended to serve as his final defense of both himself and medical professionals in general after the results of Martineau's postmortem became publicly available. In his introduction, Greenhow notes how Martineau's own representations of her lifelong experience with illness, quote, contained little fact and much imagination, end quote, before going on to remark on the specific medical aspects of the postmortem in his attempt to justify his initial assessment of her case 30 years prior. This case that had been such a source of conflict between the patient and Greenhow, as well as between the general public and the newly professionalized field of medicine for over 30 years, presents a version of Martineau that seems completely focused through the medical perspective. But what I'm interested in looking at is the rhetoricized version of her physical body and its experiences with illness and cures, such as mesmerism, that lay at the heart of this conflict. Had Martineau not published her accounts, had she not gained so wide a readership, had her rendering of her physical states of being through conditions of illness and recovery not been so persuasive to the public, doctors such as T.M. Greenhow would not have felt the need to write on her case in the ways they did. This conflict sets the stage for my talk today because it demonstrates the rhetorical power that Harriet Martineau wielded through her pursuit of publishing her experiences with illness. Martineau's Life in the Sick Room provides her most sustained examination of illness, and while she writes about this topic in many of her other works, I propose that Life in the Sick Room presents a version of her body that can teach us much about the experiences of illness, as well as about the narrative techniques that arise in illness narratives and their attempts to organize these experiences. Today, I'm interested in exploring what can be learned from this text when it is approached as an illness narrative. As a work in progress, this talk fits within the main umbrella of my dissertation, which focuses on 19th century illness narratives. In general, my dissertation looks at illness narratives from a variety of genres in order to understand what they can teach us about experiences of illness and how narrative itself takes on new shapes in response to the complex and often vexed subject matter of physical illness. For the current chapter that I'm working on and that I'm presenting today, I'm interested in thinking about how autobiographical narratives of illness operate. Specifically, in Martineau's Life in the Sick Room, I'm interested in looking at it as an example of a text that promotes and manages a version of the ill body that not only allows readers to gain an understanding of the subjective experience of being ill, but also as a text that employs a distinctive method of narrating a story of illness. For this reason, I'm interested in considering not the medical perspective on this conflict, but in examining the persuasive power of the ill body, especially when it is invoked in a published text. I'm wondering, how does the ill body operate within a narrative? What role does it play? And how might an author attempt to manage the representation of that body? Originally published anonymously in 1844, Life in the Sick Room contains 10 essays ranging in subject matter from practical advice on how to best situate an invalid's room to philosophical musings on the nature of physical pain. In the dedication of the volume, Martineau writes to an unnamed fellow sufferer, observing that, quote, "You and I and our fellow sufferers see differently, whether or not we see further," end quote. In the essays that follow, Martineau returns again and again to this point, asserting that life goes on, albeit differently, in the sick room. In this way, Life in the Sick Room aims to guide readers into understanding the subjective experience of living with chronic illness. Part autobiography, part meditation, part guidebook, the text can be read from a variety of angles. When viewed as an illness narrative, however, the text shifts from the realm of what some readers may initially interpret as didactic Victorian cant to a complex narrative demanding much of both the author and the reader. To begin, I'd like to offer a definition of what I mean by illness narrative. First, it is, as Arthur Kleinman explains, a way for sick people to, quote, order their experience of illness, end quote. This work of ordering experience invites patients to assume a level of authority over their illness, often beyond the bounds of the clinical setting. Arthur Frank's formulation of the illness narrative builds on Kleinman's and is particularly helpful when considering Martineau's work. He describes the illness He describes illness narratives as a means of privileging the experience of the patient and allowing the patient to take control over their experience, independent from the perspective of their doctors. In illness, patients are subjected to the authority of their doctors and the failings of their bodies. In telling stories of their illnesses, however, Frank argues that patients both regain a measure of control and find a way to live for others by providing what he calls a social rhetoric for how others who also suffer might learn to tell their own stories. In Frank's theory of the ill body and the kinds of stories it makes possible, the individual telling the story is both recording and creating their experience of the illness. The act of narration, therefore, is both an act of personal repair, in which the narrator regains and remakes their relationship with their body, as well as an act of social response, in which the narrator provides onlookers with a model for how to tell a story of illness. These stories, in turn, become part of the social web of stories that every new narrator draws on when they begin their own story. In Frank's theory of the illness story, the body, the illness, and the story are always being co-created. Rather than simply being stories told about the body, Frank insists illness stories are told from within the body. He notes the mystery of illness stories is their expression of the body. In the silences between the words, the tissues speak. For Frank, this confirms the genre's unique status within narrative, and it also calls for a careful understanding of how bodies and stories interact. My dissertation and this chapter specifically seek to respond to Frank's call to view the illness narrative as a unique genre. Scholars such as Ann Jurisic have further developed the work of Kleinman, Frank, and others in an attempt to find ways to understand these texts as works of both personal testimony and literary merit. Jurisic aptly observes, however, that this may require critics to craft new ways to approach these texts. Jurisic argues that often current practices of literary criticism do not engage successfully with illness narratives because they most often attempt to apply the same tools to illness narratives that they do to other genres. In Jurisic's words, quote, critics expect illness narratives to fail, both as acts of testimony and as works of literature, end quote. For Jurisic, the illness narrative is a genre that can and should be classified as literary, and it is one in which the typical critical conceptions of authorship, narration, form, conflict, characterization, plot, and reception are productively troubled. While illness narratives may attract the interest of scholars from a variety of disciplines, including anthropology, sociology, and medicine, Jurisic's study of the genre in terms of literary criticism implicitly makes the argument that these texts are works of literature in addition to being works of testimony. With this understanding of the illness narrative and its potential to operate as a literary text in addition to its more widely recognized role as a form of therapy or testimony, let's return to Harriet Martineau and Life in the SickRoom. Upon its publication in 1844, Life in the SickRoom became instantly popular and found a ready audience among a readership that had come to see invalidism as a condition worthy of public interest. While Martineau's work is not easy to classify, Life in the SickRoom can be viewed as an act of ordering, a means of creating and relating a coherent account of the experience of being ill. For her, relating the psychological realities of extended illness is a difficult task, but one that she believes to be valuable. She also recognizes that it is an equally difficult task for her readers to apprehend her meaning. As a result, Martineau's text frequently contemplates the possibilities and values of sympathy. She asks her readers to imagine the invalid's experiences, and there is an expectation throughout the text that readers will be interested in participating in this kind of imaginative work. In her efforts to demonstrate how the invalid sees differently, Martineau constructs a narrative that she roots in a location that is at once specific, but also unmoored from any actual physical location. The SickRoom, to which the title refers, is a place with which she assumes all of her readers, both the healthy and ill, are familiar. By focusing the title and the work on the SickRoom, rather than on the sick person in need of such a place, Martineau invites her readers to join her in a shared, imagined space, a space into which any number of people may pass, whether they be doctors, patients, caregivers, family members, or well-wishers. In this space, the title hints, life goes on, but to once again reference the words of her dedication, it goes on differently. While the title may invite readers into the sick room, the text does not immediately paint the scene a reader may expect. The room is there. Several of the essays directly describe the ideal setup of such a room. It should have a beautiful view, ideally one of the sea. A telescope is recommended as a helpful fixture. Houseplants should be kept at all times. Books of travel are the recommended genre. Visitors to the room are presented, children, deemed the best kinds of visitors, ministers, healthy friends. Servants are permitted in and out as they are bringing trays and adjusting pillows, lighting lamps, and closing shutters. Doctors swoop in, assess conditions, write prescriptions, take case notes. Even natural elements find their way into Martineau's sick room. The brightness of midday sun, winter winds, the waning and waxing moon, lashing rain that seeps in at the windows. Oddly, however, the self-named invalid narrator remains stubbornly and conspicuously absent from the scene. In this illness narrative, the narrator refers generally to periods of prolonged illness, but she is careful to avoid definitive descriptions of that illness or the effects it has on her physical body. This is odd for several reasons. First, as demonstrated by the contextual information provided at the beginning of the talk, it was not beyond the bounds of convention for authors and publications to present details of medical cases to the public. Physical illness and its attendant symptoms were a topic of public interest in Victorian Britain. So, we can conclude that Martineau is not participating in a cultural convention that spares the reading public from descriptions of medical details. Second, Martineau was not adhering to a personal code of privacy in her decision to withhold descriptions of her physical symptoms from her readers. As a well-known public figure, Martineau had already published several works that dealt explicitly with her own experiences of illness. Later in life, she would go on to release her autobiography, in which she wrote many more detailed accounts of her bouts of illness. So why does Life in the Sick Room, a book claiming to be written from the perspective of a person suffering through a long sickness, contain so few descriptions of the narrator's actual illness? One answer that has been proposed by Maria Frawley is that Martineau, quote, structures her study around features of the daily life of the invalid's mind, representing this interior emotional world, end quote. According to this characterization of the text, Martineau's goal to present her readers with the active life of the mind of the invalid makes it essential for her to eschew descriptions of her symptoms or specifics of her doctor's advice. The body may be inert, but the mind is active. This interpretation of the text is accurate and is in keeping with many of the contemporary reviews of Life in the Sick Room. But I think there is more to be said about the presence or absence of the sick body in this text. An illness story arises from an ill body, and that corporeal reality haunts the text, whether or not the author willingly describes it. While Martineau notes the difficulty of describing her experiences of illness, her text simultaneously makes clear that she believes it's possible and valuable to recognize the pain others experience. She says, for example, that, quote, nothing is more impossible to represent in words, even to oneself in meditative moments, than what it is to lie on the verge of life and watch, with nothing to do but to think and learn from what we behold, end quote. But she also makes clear that narrating her experience is almost a compulsion, for it allows her the privilege of, quote, annihilating the constraint and distaste inspired by our condition, and of finding ourselves restored to something like equality of intercourse with the healthy in soul, end quote. Martineau's text affords her a measure of authority over both her condition and her narrative, but she does not use medical details of her condition, nor specific instances of physical suffering to achieve this authority. In this telling, Martineau creates a narrative I, capable of standing in for the general population of similarly incapacitated sufferers. Her individual body, therefore, recedes into the background of the text, making way for an impersonal presentation of the ill body that serves as a kind of boundary with which readers must contend. In this text, Martineau writes from the perspective of the invalid, her chosen term for those living with chronic illness, and alternates between addressing an audience of fellow sufferers and admonishing an audience of healthy readers. From this position, Martineau aims to help the healthy reader understand the feelings and experiences of the invalid, while at the same time creating a sense of camaraderie or group consensus among what she calls fellow sufferers. Throughout Life in the Sick Room, Martineau addresses her fellow sufferers gently, even conspiratorially, assuring them that there is at least one person who understands them. At the same time, she presents the healthy caregivers and friends of the ill as often being inaccurate or possibly dismissive of the ill person. She envisions her text as a remedy for this, often directly calling on both groups of readers to acknowledge or to engage with her rendering of living with extended illness. Readers must consider, are they the fellow sufferers being presented with a sympathetic mirror of their experience, or are they the outsiders Martineau identifies as leading wholly different lives in the world outside the sick room? The limited and tightly managed presentation of the ill body in this illness narrative makes its moments of presence all the more notable to both groups of readers. I propose that in this account of her prolonged struggle with ill health, the text creates and manages distances between Martineau as the author, Martineau as the narrator of her experience, and Martineau's ill body that has given rise to her need to provide this account in the first place. This results in a version of her experience that allows readers to step into the sick room with Martineau as their guide, rather than as an exhibit on display. In arriving at this conclusion, I must refer back to Ann Jurasik's call to view illness narratives as texts that can function both as acts of testimony and as works of literature. As I consider what Martineau is doing in Life in the Sick Room, I find it helpful to think about how this text both conforms to and pushes the boundaries of what we typically expect from an illness narrative. While the text clearly aligns with the overall goals of an illness narrative as something capable of repairing the teller's sense of order and guiding readers in their own experiences with illness, it pushes those boundaries in its consistent refusal to portray the narrator's ill body. In this way, one of the most interesting elements of Life in the Sick Room is located not so much in the narrative content itself, but in how the text plays with what narratologists would call focalization. While there is much debate over the term, I find James Phelan's interpretation of focalization to be the most helpful in relation to my interest in illness narratives. According to Phelan, focalization is the answer to the question, who is perceiving? In narrative discourse, it is the who sees dimension folded into the more widely used term point of view. Phelan uses a number of metaphors rooted in perception to explore this topic. Focalization is an angle of vision, it is a path through the story world, and it is a set of lenses through which readers view the events of a story. Phelan's explanation of focalization is particularly useful in relation to illness narratives because it makes room for shifts in focalization between a number of perceivers, including characters who act within a story, narrators who speak from beyond the limits of the story world, and even narrators constructing the elements of their lived experiences into forms of nonfiction narrative, as in the case of life writing. In each of these cases, Phelan notes, focalization shifts, and an audience may be asked to, quote, doff the narrator's lenses and don the characters, end quote, as they make their way through the narrative. In an illness narrative, there is, of course, the potential for focalization through a narrator constructing the events and or a character living the events within the narrative. But there is also another potential focalizer, another set of lenses, the ill body itself. While the body may not provide an angle of vision in the ways we are used to characters and narrators doing so, it can, in a narrative centered on an experience of illness, proffer an alternative or even simultaneous set of lenses through which readers can interpret the events of the story. This dynamic is described by Rita Sharon in her work Narrative Medicine with the term corporeal gap. According to Sharon, a practicing physician and medical educator, the corporeal gap emerges in a healthcare setting when the body being examined tells a different story than the patient describing their illness, resulting in the need for healthcare practitioners to resist their training to attend to the body alone and to listen to the stories of the people within those bodies as well. For Sharon, the corporeal gap is akin to the autobiographical gap that occurs in life writing. In an autobiography, the act of telling gives rise to a split self, a narrator and a protagonist. Sharon extends this, saying that in illness narratives, a corporeal gap also emerges in which the teller of the self tells of the body of the self, creating a momentary separation between the teller who reports and the body that feels. In this formulation, Sharon encourages practitioners to read the body and to listen to patients in order to develop interventions that bring about more effective healing. Sharon teaches her readers to look out for how narrators create both a self and a body in their stories. She asserts, quote, "The body is and is not the self," end quote, emphasizing how the act of narration requires the teller to split themselves into narrator, narrated self, and narrated body. I propose that each of these three entities can act as potential focalizers in illness narratives. In addition to the author and the narrative I created to tell the story, the physical body that this I references becomes yet another set of lenses that may direct the reader's gaze. The I that reports and the body that feels must always be present in any illness narrative, and these simultaneous presences create a potential for gaps to emerge in the narration. In other words, an understanding of focalization allows readers of illness narratives to glimpse the moments where the I that is reporting and the body that is experiencing exist simultaneously on the page. At times, they exist in harmony, reinforcing or submitting to the version of events being told by the other. At other times, however, they present two different angles of vision, and by doing so, push the narrative onto uncertain ground. These are moments where the gaps that Sharon references emerge, revealing much both about how narratives are constructed and about how readers might navigate between the different sets of lenses available to them. In the case of Life in the Sick Room, the ill body and its attendant experiences remain firmly in the background of the text. In a scan of the text, I could not find more than 5 times where Martineau references a specific moment of physical pain or provides a description of her own physical symptoms. Instead, Martineau more often writes using plural possessive or second-person pronouns. For example, Essay 4, which is called Life to the Invalid, often pivots between plural possessive and second-person pronouns. This style of narration offers an angle of vision to the readers that at first seems aggressively inclusive. The lenses that Phelan refers to seem to be crammed unceremoniously over our eyes, as Martineau describes our experiences in the sick room and narrates to the reader what you feel throughout these experiences. However, it becomes clear that Martineau's intended audience is intentionally split between healthy and ill readers. The inclusivity these pronouns seem to indicate shifts to form a boundary in which readers must consider which camp they belong in, the healthy or the ill. Let's consider the following example from Life to the Invalid. You, my fellow sufferer, now lying on your couch, the newspaper dropping from your hand, while your eyes are fixed on the lamp. Are you smiling at the thought that you have preserved up to this time more or less of that faith of your childhood, that everything that is in print is true? The rendering of the sick person in a reclining position asks the reader to perceive the scene depending on where they fall on the spectrum between healthy and ill. For the fellow sufferer, the angle of perception is fully embodied. They are the you of the scene. It is their legs sprawled on the couch, their hand loosely holding the paper, and their eyes staring at the lamp. After being invited to lie on the couch, however, the sick reader is reminded of the fact that this is not actually their experience when the narrator directs a question to them. The question is an odd moment in which one group of readers will recognize an address from the narrator, who they assume has actually inhabited this reclining position and has had these thoughts run through her mind. The other group of readers, the healthy, are seemingly disregarded in this scene. They are not the you addressed by the narrator. Yet, as readers of the text, they are nevertheless witnesses of the scene. By addressing the you specifically to fellow sufferers, Martineau intentionally distances the healthy reader from this scene. In this role as outside and distanced observer, the healthy reader may potentially reach a valuable insight. They see a sight that may seem familiar, an ill person lying on a couch, too inert to read the paper falling from their hand. It is the image of what they may see as the pitiful invalid, weak, disinterested, and torpid. If they read to the question mark, however, the healthy reader may understand that while the body before them may be inactive, the mind is prepared to pursue a series of musings that may surprise them. In the case of both the healthy and the ill reader, this presentation of an ill body on a couch is oddly impersonal. It is a description of a series of bodily poses, but it is not exactly anyone's body. It does not belong to the reader, nor does it exactly belong to the narrator. The presence of the you pronoun keeps it from being a kind of mannequin or model brought in to illustrate a point. Instead, I think this is a moment where the self splits, and a gap between the teller that reports and the body that feels opens in productive ways. In one way, this is a moment where Martineau, as the teller who reports, allows the reader to imagine an embodied moment that she herself may have experienced. While this is not a moment that may be of medical significance, it is representative of much of what Martineau has hinted at as being part of her experience of illness. In this passage, a number of focalizers offer themselves to the reader, and depending on how they understand themselves in relation to Martineau's text, individual readers may choose which set of lenses to use to understand this scene. There is, of course, the option of inhabiting the you, in which you are cast as the embodied inhabitant of the sick room, a sufferer so closely identified with the body being presented on the couch that they feel as though they are having their own experience narrated to them. A second potential angle of vision is to enter the text in the position of the observer, perhaps a friend or caregiver, trying to gauge the sick person's level of pain as they rest in this position. These two positions divide the readers into the groups of healthy and ill that Martineau so often directly addresses in the text. The third angle of vision, however, makes way for the potential moment of separation between the story the teller relates and the ill body that the teller inhabits. The third option is to read the passage as a close observer not of the you on the couch, but of the narrator perceiving this you and describing this scene. In a moment like this, the text operates according to a logic of what Phelan calls dual focalization. Phelan defines this type of focalization as a narrative situation in which the perceptions of two agents are communicated simultaneously. The two options readily offered to the reader seem at first to be perceiving through the you or perceiving through the onlooker. However, in the case of an illness narrative like Life in the Sick Room, the presence of illness creates a dynamic in which the perceptions of both the teller who reports and the body that feels may be communicated simultaneously to the reader. While a body may not perceive in the same way a person does, scholars of illness narrative have made it clear that the role of the physical body in a story of illness should not be discounted. As I quoted before, Arthur Frank described this dynamic by asserting, "The mystery of illness stories is their expression of the body. In the silences between words, the tissues speak." In this text, silences around the body occur more often than narration of the body. However, in moments such as the example we've been looking at, there is always the potential for the body of the narrator to emerge as a focalizer, even when that body is distanced through the denial of first-person pronouns. Martineau, the writer, paints a scene for her readers in this passage, but with the introduction of an ill body, Martineau's own extended experience with illness enters into the text. Although she does not own this ill body, its state of being presents the reader with a range of insights into the lived experience of Martineau during her time of illness. Devoid of any specific inhabitant and quickly left behind as the text moves to consider the ways the mind of a sick person relates to events in the world, the body stretched across the couch rises to the surface of the reader's perceptions for a moment to provide a reminder that this is indeed a text rooted in its author's long struggle with a poorly understood and often untreatable illness. This moment is seemingly denied, as it is not until late in the next essay that either physical symptoms of illness or representation of a physical body are mentioned. This brief passage, however, does momentarily make room for an alternative mode of perception on the experiences described in the text. It does so in ways that keep and even extend the distances between the author's lived experience, the narrator's presentation of those experiences, and the reality of the ill body that skirts along the margins of this text. For much of Life in the Sick Room, the reader's gaze is directed not by the body experiencing illness, but by the narrator who is seemingly determined to keep that body out of sight. The strangeness of this dynamic has been noted by a number of scholars. Rachel Abloh theorizes that this feature of Martineau's writing is in part due to Martineau's understanding of pain and subjectivity. Abloh writes, quote, "Part of what makes Martineau's writing so strange is the extent to which, rather than regarding one's own pain as the thing one cannot help but recognize, and the pain experienced by the other as the thing we can only aspire to understand, the usual problem skepticism confronts, she takes the suffering of the other as relatively self-evident and one's own pain as relatively opaque." End quote. Within this formulation, Martineau's illness narrative in turn reflects an understanding of pain as something all readers have access to, as the pain of others is, as Abloh said, relatively self-evident. Martineau is not attempting to convince readers of her pain. Instead, the text more often is interested in presenting models of mental superiority over pain as a means of living through an experience that may be opaque to the self. As such, one of the chief effects of life in the sick room is the construction of boundaries. In this text, the equation of the exchange of pain is reversed. What emerges is an account conspicuously devoid of medical detail or bodily suffering, in service to, as Abloh explains, Martineau's view of pain as a feature of life that all may see in others while at the same time not being able to fully understand in themselves. This mode of understanding pain creates a silence around the experiences of the individual. By denying the admission of her own embodied knowledge of illness, Martineau is perhaps seeking a way to write an illness narrative that places boundaries around personal experiences in the interest of creating shared ones. The rest of my chapter on this topic will be devoted to exploring other ways that Martineau and other writers of autobiographical illness narratives employ representations of the physical body in their texts. This examination of life in the sick room demonstrates a potentially unique feature of illness narratives among other literary genres. In an illness narrative, I am proposing, the ill body presents itself as an agent that shifts the options for focalization in a narrative. In the case of Martineau, she may see the body and its symptoms as specific to each sufferer, but the invocation of an impersonal ill body makes it possible for readers to perceive the sick room as a place where individuals can be fused into a sympathetic body of fellow readers. This text, which she published anonymously and dedicated to an unnamed invalid, becomes the field on which the healthy and the ill can meet to contemplate protracted experiences of illness. Martineau does not dwell on medicalized descriptions of her sufferings. Instead, she asserts her independence as an expert in the sick room, capable of lending solace to fellow sufferers and instructing the healthy who may come into contact with them. While Dr. Greenhouse's final presentation of Martineau's postmortem and his initial assessment of her case may have approximated medical fact, Martineau's own version of her illness and periods of relief achieved astonishing levels of publicity and persuasive power during her lifetime. One way in which this occurs in this narrative is through the method of focalization made possible through Martineau's distanced ill body. The individual body and its complaints become things that Martineau resists representing in her efforts to craft a text that might maintain a level of impersonality, capable of drawing in and speaking to varied groups of readers. By doing so, she is perhaps avoiding one of the chief difficulties of being ill that she describes in the final pages of Life in the Sick Room, when she says, "It is the prerogative of the healthy and happy to give pleasure wherever they go. It is the worst humiliation and grievance of the suffering that they cause suffering. To the far-seeing invalid, who is aware not only of this immediate effect, but of its remotest consequences, this is the most afflicting feature of his condition. If we can, by any management, evade this liability, we have cause to be grateful indeed." As the far-seeing invalid of this text, Martineau lends us her imagination and her experience on her own terms, managing a version of her body that invites the reader to perceive the sick room and the life within it in ways that resist spectatorship and encourage sympathy. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions, and there is a microphone so that people on the live stream can hear the questions. And I think Maggie has graciously agreed to pass that around.
So thank you, Hayley, for the really interesting conversation. I'm hoping that you will take us a little bit to the history. Why 19th century, and what you think? So the broad question is why 19th century? Mm-hmm. What's going on with illness narratives at this time period? But I'm specifically interested in the term invalid and what Martineau means by it and what it may have meant at the time, mm-hmm. and what you see as relevant for that term itself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I guess to start with why 19th century, I think as Martineau represents, she was someone who while she had this conflict with Greenhow, throughout the rest of her life still corresponded with and sought the treatment of many other doctors. And it's a time where medicine is becoming professionalized in ways that weren't as set as it is in our own day. And so the kinds of illness narratives that get written are often much more focused on the patient's individual experience and interpretation, separate from a medical perspective, that Frank and Kleinman and other theorists note as being like one of the benefits of writing or reading an illness narrative. So there's that element of it. And then Martineau's choice of the word invalid, Maria Frawley, who I quote a few times here, has a full study of the concept of an invalid in the Victorian era, but she describes it as being a term that had a lot of cultural currency. It was a label that people would either assign to others or assume for themselves, and she points out it could mean a variety of things. So at first it was used to describe someone in military service who was no longer able to serve, and then it sort of developed into being a term that people could use either to describe they've reached a level of tiredness where they're going to remove themselves from the world and live as an invalid for a few years and then return. Or in the case of someone like Martineau, her physical symptoms prevented her from being able to participate in life as she normally would have. So I think she found the term useful because of its cultural sort of currency at the time, and also because she was interested in presenting herself as a type of authority. And so because people could sort of choose the term and apply it to themselves, I think she found value in that instead of being labeled by a certain disease or another medical term. Does that help?
It does.
Okay.
So is the invalid a physical description? Is it a social identity adopted?
Yeah, I think it could be, I think there's evidence in the time of it being used as both. So, and there was like a big fad of like an invalid cup, an invalid bed, an invalid chair, like a whole category of products that were brought out to make invalid life more comfortable. And then also, she's also participating in what was, I don't want to call it a trend, but what was a more popular term at the time. So people like Darwin, Florence Nightingale, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, many intellectuals would take years away, sometimes due to physical symptoms, sometimes due to like exhaustion from work, and then return after this period of invalidism. So yeah, I think there's a lot. It's not a set term, I don't think, and there's a lot going on with it, but it was something that was culturally understood at the time as being possibly from health, possibly from exhaustion, a variety of factors.
Thanks, Hayley. This was so interesting, and I love your use of vocalization for the stuff that Martineau is doing. I don't know if it's possible to go back to the excerpt. Yeah, this one.
Okay.
I love the excerpts you included from her writing. I could see how it's sort of like simultaneously alienating and inviting, and it's just really interesting. As you were reading this quote, I kept sort of grappling with like the second half of the quote, and this might be totally peripheral to some of what you're discussing, but just in terms of like this theory of vocalization, and I was sort of asking myself like, okay, do I identify with the first part? Like I've experienced something like that. And then when it shifts to like, are you smiling at the thought that you have, and goes on, and it felt almost like a non sequitur to me, like this suddenly, are you smiling at the thought? Because I was trying to inhabit like this space of like suffering. And so I was just, and it might just be like, I don't know, that's a really strange part of her writing. But I was just curious your thoughts on that second part. Is it almost like a different focalization that shifts into a more like mental disembodied space, or like a more optimistic retrospective position? Or I was just curious what you thought.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because the question itself, right, like leads into the whole focus of the rest of the essay, which is not interesting to this talk, because she's talking about like how people read newspapers differently when they're sick than when they're healthy. But I think one thing that, as you were talking, it made me think about is that one of her, I guess, focuses that she keeps coming back to in this text is that while this person who is sick may be removed from the world, their position in that space allows them to see things differently and allows them to see things in ways that may be valuable to people who are outside that space. And so I think this is a moment where she's doing like the second person thing, drawing a certain group of readers in, and then, I don't know if the word is like coercively, but she tends to like draw readers in and then launch into her own musings in ways that seem to lead them into it. But I don't know, right, that everyone would agree with her. So I think it is an example of like, she does this quite a few times of sort of drawing people in. And even in the other quotes that I included that I didn't have on the screen, I think all of them either used you or our. She almost never says like I. And so I think that was what really interested me here. And that even when she moves into what are clearly her own opinions, she still had this hook at the beginning that made the reader feel like, yeah, I'm the you, sure. We'll talk about this. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think it is an odd moment. Yeah.
I actually have an online question.
Okay.
Very exciting. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. Can you tell us a little bit more about your SAGES class? I'd love to hear how you teach this topic to undergraduate students.
Okay, yay, teaching. So I loved teaching this class, and Martineau was actually one of the texts that we read repeatedly throughout the semester. And it was, I feel like I had this experience when I first read Martineau, and undergrads definitely had this experience as well, that it is off-putting to read at first because she is so like aggressive about like, you are the healthy person and this is what you don't understand, or you are the sick person and this is what you understand. And so there was a lot of discussion around, what do you do when a text like presents you with what seems like two options, and how do you read through that or around it? And then I had students write really wonderful research papers thinking about Martineau and then other authors' positions, either from the perspective of gender and how that affected their level of authority over their experience, and perhaps why they wrote about it. And then also, their thoughts on the dynamic, which came up in here and comes up in a lot of 19th century narratives of sort of medical authority versus patient authority over what's going on in their experiences. So the undergrads definitely picked up on that quite a bit and did great things with it. But yeah, and I think it's a challenging text to read, and I think a lot of them at first were like, why? What? And so I think getting into the discussions and then, once they started doing research, it really opened up their perspectives on all the different ways of reading a text like this, right? Like it doesn't fit neatly into perhaps how we understand the way genre should work. And so I think it was a challenge in that way too.
Does she describe her physical pain, and does she get any responses from her fellow sufferers?
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting that she published it anonymously at first, and then people seemed to pretty quickly figure out who was the writer. And so in reviews of the book, reviews were very positive for the most part. Many people commented on how they appreciated her representation of the life of the mind, and how that can go forward even when someone is confined the way she was. In the times where she does describe pain, it's often similar to this quote. She doesn't describe a personal moment. It's often like, she has one where she talks about, you will remember after a night of prolonged pain, how wonderful blank is, right? Like, and so she sort of moves into moments where you can tell she's speaking from her own experience, but she doesn't actually own it. And she sort of puts it out there as something a reader could take up. And then it moves often into, she'll use a moment of physical reality to move into talking about like what mentally happened or what was the subjective nature of that experience. So she does that in this text, but then, like I mentioned in her autobiography later on, the first few pages, she's going on and on about, injuries and illnesses she had in her childhood with very, the kinds of descriptions we'd expect of an illness. So I think it had, to do with some of the goals she had for this particular work, and how, that level of anonymity, both in choosing to keep her name off the title page and then also choosing to keep, I think, her own experiences out of the pages is interesting.
And does she express anger at the medical profession's powerlessness to help her?
She, not so much in the text itself. She talks about, at points like, times you may find some treatment wasn't useful, and so you move on to something else, and how you're always, she describes the mental effect of always seeking after a new treatment. In her letters, she talks about her anger towards Greenhouse specifically, not publishing in a journal, not publishing in Latin, choosing to publish in a pamphlet in English that anybody could read. But she, like I said, towards the beginning, she still sought out medical advice and had relationships with many doctors who treated her throughout her life. So she didn't fully decamp and decide, the medical community wasn't for her. But she did have this insistence on, this is my experience, I'm going to write about it and publish on it. And if somebody's, but I think was used to having people publicly discuss her case, which was a strange thing for her life.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hayley. I wasn't at all familiar with Martineau, and it was really enlightening talk. It's been a few years since I've taught a course on religion, medicine, and suffering, but the most recent time, Arthur Frank came to campus through the Humanities Center. And when the students met with him, they were kind of incredulous that he was still this living, walking, not too old person, in part because, unlike Kleinman and so many of the authors in medical anthropology, he invokes faith in some very personal ways in some key chapters in that book to describe his understanding of pain and to build his own illness narrative. And I only mention that the students react that way because to a 21st century young audience at a school like ours, that seems uncommon or maybe uncomfortable to them. But in her time period, in the 19th century, it was much more common. And in fact, there was a whole set of literature, particularly among Catholics, but some other groups as well, that saw suffering as kind of sanctity. I mean, they really did look, they made that stark distinction you just spoke about during the Q&A between the sick and the healthy, and the sick had a certain holiness. So I was surprised that in these passages in your talk, she doesn't seem to be invoking that framework at all. And I was just curious if she invokes it elsewhere or if you wanted to speculate or know why she's working in what strikes me as a different framework. And I'm also curious whether that non-religious framework contributed to her being a bestseller at the time.
So Martineau was a Unitarian, and some scholars have described Life in the Sick Room as the swan song of her Unitarianism. So she, a few years later, when she publishes the autobiography, she talks sort of disparagingly about Life in the Sick Room, because there are passages where she does, sort of participate in that sort of discourse, where she describes suffering as being something that allows you to understand the nature of the good in the world, that pain is passing, and that it can refine your mind to be able to receive, an understanding of what goodness is and what is going to endure. She doesn't specifically, necessarily relate it to solely religious experiences, but she does participate in that kind of language, that pain can be refining, or that it can be, she doesn't use the word sanctifying, but that it can be something that elevates the mind above, the worldly, and makes someone, able to see things differently. But later in her life, she sort of moves away from that, becomes more aligned with atheism, and I think sees what she was doing at points in this text as being, I think she felt like it was too religious at times, even though she wasn't explicitly participating in that. So you're right, there is that element, and I don't know that some of it was tied to just her expectations of what readers would expect from a text like this. Life in the Sick Room became very popular among invalids who kept like commonplace books, and many of them showed up in like Christian commonplace books of passages that were comforting to invalids. So her text did become sort of culturally popular among evangelical circles in ways that maybe later on she wasn't happy about. But yeah, it's such an interesting dynamic, and I think I need to look into it more. Thank you.
That's great. She was a woman ahead of her time in many ways. If there aren't any other questions, I think,
Hayley, that brought up for me, could you talk a little bit more about the reading practices at the time? Like, what were, you sort of hinted at it just now with the commonplace books, but what were people doing with this text?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, published anonymously, it was reviewed pretty heavily across a number of different publications. I think one of the only people who really objected to it was Thomas Carlyle. He said that she acted like a female Christ, laid there and like expected us to come view her sufferings. Was not a fan. So just like but for the most part, very well accepted and became like a bestseller. And so as far as I can tell, she's participating in, I guess, a genre that's popular at the time, and that most often was much more like pronouncedly participating in a religious discourse, more so than hers. But yeah, I mean, so far I've just come across like this idea that the commonplace book of people who would, take passages from different things and organize it around topics for their own edification or for, to pass on to others. Also, she got many letters, right? She kept a huge correspondence with many people. And so I think it entered into sort of her way of corresponding with people and the topics that she would write on and write to people about. But yeah, I think that's what I've come across so far, but it's an area to look into more as well.
That's fascinating, particularly the interaction between that letter writing and her other published work.
Yeah.
It seems like another collection of bodies that are haunting what she's doing. So,
Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Does she talk about her social situation? Does she have visitors? Mm-hmm. Is she highly lonely? Mm-hmm. And what about her wealth? She appears to have servants. Does she live with family or alone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she, for the period of illness preceding her publication of Life in the Sick Room, she went to live in a small village, and it was not like an elaborate house. Like literally, she had like one room set up for her because she was pretty immobile. And so had made enough money off of her writings that she was able to support herself. And she believed that part of what led to her illness was the amount of work she had been doing up to that time. So she was a very active author. She corresponded heavily with many people. She talked about how her level of fame was one of the things that contributed to her illness. And so then I think she talks about, in terms of loneliness, the loneliness of feeling like she's not understood, which I think is what drives her to write something like this. And that dedication where she's talking to the unnamed person she's dedicating it to, she mentions the fact that I've known you've been ill for a long time, and I've seen the way you've handled it, and it's encouraged me and brought me, to this point where I feel like I can write about this. So knowing about your experience from afar has sort of brought me to feel less lonely. And that's part of her problem with healthy people in the book, as she talks about how they're not good visitors because they come in and they tell you, like, don't worry, you'll return to your active ways someday. She's like, no, I'm doing stuff now. I'm not dead yet, that kind of feeling. And then she had a wide social circle that would often come and sit with her and visit her. And she was known even in this period of time, even during her illness, as like a wonderful conversationalist. So she was sought out and visited, even if she didn't always like her visitors, it seems like.
Well, thank you very
Right,
much,
thank
Hayley.
you.
It was wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the questions.